The truth is right in front of you. The following list of events follows the same order as the events presented in Genesis 2. Chapter 2. Dry land has already appeared. No vegetation has yet sprouted. God created the first Adam from the ground. God created vegetation. God created birds. God created animals. God created the woman Eve. Now, compare the order immediately above with the order of events that were given in the first chapter of Genesis. Chapter 1. On the third day of creation, dry land appeared out of the water. Vegetation, both plants and trees, sprouted. On the fifth day of creation, God created the fish. God created the birds. On the sixth day of creation, God created the animals. God created the man in his image and likeness. It does not take a genius, a rocket scientist, or even a person of more than average intelligence to see that the order of events is not the same. Therefore, the first fact you need to accept, if you want to be intellectually honest, is this. The account in Genesis 2 begins with a description of circumstances that existed only on the third day of creation. That is immediately obvious to anyone who tries to reconcile the two accounts. Chapter 1. On the third day of creation, dry land appeared out of the water. Vegetation, both plants and trees, sprouted. Chapter 2. Dry land has already appeared. No vegetation has yet sprouted. God created the first Adam from the ground. God created vegetation. Genesis 2 plainly tells us God created the first Adam after dry ground had appeared out of the water, but before any vegetation had sprouted. Any moron who wants to argue otherwise has to explain away the fairly straightforward statement Moses makes as to why no vegetation had yet appeared on the earth. Genesis 2:5b. For the Lord God had not sent rain upon the earth, and there was no man to cultivate the ground. I'm not saying the obvious meaning of that text cannot be explained away to the satisfaction of close-minded simpletons who want to go on believing Satan's lie. I'm just saying that there is no need for them to be so absurdly creative. Why not just let the plain meaning of the text stand as it is written? Moses can only be describing a time on the third day of creation, after dry ground had appeared out of the water and before any vegetation had sprouted, when he says this. Genesis 2:7. Then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Moses goes on to tell us that after God created the first Adam, he then made vegetation sprout from the same ground he used to form the first Adam. Genesis 2:8-9. And the Lord God planted a garden toward the east in Eden, and there he placed the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground the Lord God caused to grow every tree that is pleasing to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't be dense. Moses obviously intends us to understand that the first Adam was formed of the dust of the ground on the third day of creation, after dry ground had appeared and before any vegetation had sprouted. Knowing that, you should be able to see that the remainder of the account in Genesis 2 is nothing more than a recapitulation of events that occurred on the fifth and sixth days of creation. Chapter 1. On the third day of creation, dry land appeared out of the water. Vegetation, both plants and trees, sprouted. On the fifth day of creation, God created the fish. God created the birds. On the sixth day of creation, God created the animals. Chapter 2. Dry land has already appeared. No vegetation has yet sprouted. God created the first Adam from the ground. God created vegetation. God created birds. God created animals. If you want to refute my understanding of Genesis 2, consider this. You have to explain why Genesis 1 says the man that God created in his image and likeness was created after the fish, birds, and animals, whereas Genesis 2 plainly says God created the man before he created the birds and animals in an attempt to find a helper for the man. That is no easy task, to be sure, but if someone wants to go on believing Satan's lie, I'm certain they are up to it. and those who have insight into the truth can only stand by and marvel at their ignorance. You may have noticed that my listing of the events described in Genesis 1 did not include the last creative act that God completed on the sixth day of creation, the creation of the man in his image and likeness. That is because, contrary to the monstrous lie that the agents of Satan successfully implanted in the early church, that event is not even mentioned in Genesis 2. The account Moses gives in Genesis 2 clearly describes the creation of the man we normally call Adam. That much, at least, is readily understood. What is not understood at all today is the fact that the account in Genesis 1 is describing the creation of the second Adam, the man, that God created in his own image and likeness when he resurrected him from the dead. If you want to read a description of how God created that man, you have to read the rest of the Hebrew and Greek scriptures. That's because Jesus Christ is the only man that God has thus far created in his own image and likeness, although there soon will be other members of the man, Adam, who join him in that absolutely incredible experience.